The Gourmet by Drew W. Davidson. Part 3. I saw your eyes sharpen when I mentioned the lands I have visited. Travel has always sounded glamorous to those who have not done enough of it, and exhausting to those who have done too much. People who have never left their birthplace like to say that people are the same everywhere. This comforts them. It excuses inattention. The truth is untidy. Human beings are human beings, yes, but the soil writes itself into bone, and the air signs its name in the lungs, and the local water hides in the veins. To drink in Paris is not the same as to drink in Calcutta. To drink in the Congo is not the same as to drink on the high plains of the Andes. Once I understood as much, travel became inevitable. Do not imagine me bounding from continent to continent with a hunter's enthusiasm. Appetite without focus is gluttony. I left my city because my tongue began to suspect what my benefactor had never needed to tell me. Geography is an ingredient. Paris was my first course. I arrived in a century that was very pleased with itself. Gas lamps burned amber along clean boulevards. Cafes spilled talk and smoke and perfume into the night. In Paris, the blood is rarely simple. It is a stew thickened by books and revolutions and butter. I tasted artists who had bled themselves on canvas, their veins sharp with turpentine and copper and fatigue. I tasted a banker who carried gold in his mouth, not as coins, but as a dry metallic assurance that the world must bow. Parisians taught me how ideas ferment in the blood, how luxury leaves a glaze of cream over fatigue, how the body becomes a ledger for its own opinions. From Paris, I went east. Constantinople was a banquet that almost undid me. There the East and the West lay tangled like two lovers who have quarrelled but cannot bring themselves to leave the bed. The air tasted of smoke and spice, wool and sea. In the bazaar I watched a silk seller laugh with bright cruelty at her customers. When I slipped a taste from her wrist in the press of a crowd, I found saffron and pepper and the weariness of bargaining handed down through generations. Trade itself had entered her blood. Coins and caravans and ships had written themselves into her. She taught me that commerce is as strong a seasoning as faith. India was not a dish so much as a table breaking under the weight of its own plates. In Calcutta the air lay thick with heat and exhaust and sweet fruit beginning to rot. There I found a scholar devoted to ancient hymns. His blood carried ink, yes, but underneath it was honey that had stood too long in the sun. Contradiction. Detachment resting on a bed of devotion. I learned that piety and scholarship do not always agree about what constitutes a good life. Further south, a fisherman who had never left his lagoon tasted of salt, tamarind, and wood smoke. He carried the ocean as surely as any admiral. I understood then that to travel is not always to move. Sometimes the land travels through you. Africa breathed in wider rhythms. In the Congo I drank from a hunter whose life had been spear and drumbeat, meat and river. His blood was whole, not refined, not arranged, but complete. Later, in Egypt, a woman selling amulets beside the Nile tasted of dust and papyrus, and grief so old it might have outlived language. Her body was modern. Her flavour was older than the stones behind her. The land remembers longer than flesh. Whoever drinks in such places cannot help but take in centuries. The Americas came late. They were young then, raw. In New Orleans I tasted Creole blood that was carnival itself. Sugar and rum, brass and smoke. It intoxicated. I left dizzy and ashamed of my own lack of restraint. In the plains of the north, settlers tasted like unseasoned bread. Sufficient. Unremarkable. Among the people they were erasing, I found a Sioux warrior whose blood still carried prairie grass and horse sweat, and a pride that rose in the mouth like a hawk. That taste has not returned. They killed it. They called it progress. Each journey wrote another line in my atlas of the tongue. The Alps nested in the sharp tang of a goat herder whose lungs had grown thin in clean air. The Mediterranean gleamed in the oil-rich blood of an Italian whose veins carried olives and sun-thickened wine. The Andes thinned everything. High shepherds tasted metallic, as if the sky itself had grated into them. There were surprises. I expected England to be boiled and bland, rain diluted. I tasted a London poet who had starved himself for his verses and found instead tea leaves, ash, and beauty held together by stubbornness. I expected China to taste only of rice and silk and found in a court eunuch in Beijing a bitterness like over-steeped green tea, sorrowful and yet still alert. These surprises taught me to distrust generalizations. Nations may flavor the pot, but individuals brew their own ferment within it. Travel is never without risk. In Portugal, I misjudged a priest. He had heard rumors, he saw only sin, never craft. He watched his flock too closely and tasted of rusted iron even before he knew my name. He hunted me with words. I escaped with difficulty and a wound that a younger version of me would have mistaken for shame. It was not shame. It was irritation at my own carelessness. I learned then that persecution has its own flavor. Those who hate with all their strength taste of metal worn against stone. Unpleasant, but instructional. Portugal was the closest I have come, in those early travels, to being treated as quarry. It began, as such things often do, with a trivial indulgence. I had been in Lisbon for several months, drunk on the contrast between the clean salt of the harbour and the sweet heaviness of the bakeries. I had taken too freely from sailors who sang in the taverns, from students who argued over wine, from widows who kept their grief under black cloth and clutched rosaries too tightly. I was not sloppy, I was not loud. But repetition leaves patterns, and patterns draw eyes. The priest was not distinguished. He was not a cardinal or an inquisitor, only a parish clergyman with a face like old bread and hands that shook when he lifted the chalice. I would have ignored him entirely had I not tasted, in the air of his church, a faint undernote of iron that did not belong to the incense or to the wood. He had heard rumors, not of me by name. We do not give them that. Rumors of people found pale and too peaceful, of sailors who did not wake from dreams they had not drunk enough to earn. The city whispered of demons and punishments, and angels displeased by the new cafes on the hill. The priest listened. He decided, in his frightened way, that he was a sword sent to cleave sin from the city. His blood, when I eventually tasted it, bore no trace of courage. Only rust from wielding a weapon he did not understand. He began visiting taverns late at night, speaking of temptation. He hinted at darkness in the streets that only the righteous could fight. He had no idea what he was looking for. He watched the door, the bar, the women. He did not understand that he should have watched the silences. He noticed me because I was always there. Not drunk, not loud. Listening. Always listening. The wrong kind of stillness. He followed me one night as I left the harbour. He thought he was being subtle. Thoughts like that are the first sign of danger in stupid men. I let him follow me as far as the warehouse district. Curiosity, again. How far would he take it? How much of his fear would congeal into action? In the shelter of a narrow alley, he stepped forward and named me servant of the devil. His voice cracked on the word. He held a crucifix out as if it were a knife. He was shaking so hard that the cheap metal rattled against its chain. He expected me to recoil. The only thing I recoiled from was his breath. He quoted, badly, from a book he had never really read. He told me I would be cast down. He told me he would protect his flock. He told me he would see me driven out. In another mood, I might have laughed. In another century, I might have drained him on the spot and left his body arranged in an unfortunate accident. Instead, I stepped closer. I took his wrist gently, as one might take the hand of an uncle who has said something embarrassing at dinner. I tasted the surface of his skin without puncturing it. Cowardice, pride. a sticky, cloying desire to be seen as a savior by those who would never remember his name. Not even interesting ruin. Behind him, in the deeper dark, I smelled something else. Not holiness, not fate. The faint, sour note of other ears that had followed his. There were men who wished very much for the devil to be real, because it would make their own cruelties easier to justify. I let the priest go. I told him very softly that he was wrong about almost everything, including himself. I suggested that he go home and reconsider the size of his God. Then I left Lisbon that night on a ship whose name I do not remember. I have never returned. From that small unpleasantness I learned two things. First, that even the dullest instruments can cut you if you forget they exist. Second, that there are dangers I cannot taste until they act. Fear, hatred, superstition, these all have their flavors, but they seldom announce themselves with the clarity of a rare vintage. They clump around the edges of crowds, waiting for someone else to speak an excuse aloud. When I travel now, I taste the air not only for spices and soils and old stones. I taste it for the beginning of mobs. After years of wandering, I knew more than I had meant to. I could drink a man and tell you where he had grown up, whether he had ever stood at sea, whether he had breathed coal dust or cedar or desert wind. I had become less a predator and more a cartographer. It sounds noble put so plainly. It was not. It was practice. It was the widening of the palate. Still, somewhere between Florence and St. Petersburg, between Cairo and Quebec, I began to understand a darker truth. Novelty fades. Even the rarest spice becomes familiar after the third jar. The tongue grows clever and then bored. Variety for its own sake no longer satisfies. That is when I began to hunt not for places or professions, but for vintages, for souls that had burned themselves into something singular. It is that pursuit which marks the highest and lowest points of my existence, and which has stained my memory in a way that no distance will dilute. You shift in your chair at the word soul. Do not worry. I will not ask for yours without warning. Not yet.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.